Evening, you lot. Welcome to Evil Exposed. I'm Maggie, and I'm here to drag you through the muck and filth of the world's darkest tales. Got the guts to stick around? Tonight's story is a nasty one, full of blood, bones, and nightmares that'll make you piss yourself. Think you're tough enough? Well, let's dive into the horror. Brace yourselves, it's going to be a rough ride. The Haunting of Sarah Jenkins. Chapter 1. The Quiet Suburb. Nestled under a blanket of twilight, the quiet suburb of Willow Creek exuded an air of serene normalcy. Lined with neatly manicured lawns and quaint picket fences, it was the kind of place where neighbors exchanged pleasantries over morning coffee and children played freely in the streets until dusk. It was the sort of place that seemed untouched by time, where everyone knew everyone else, and secrets were rare. Among the many homes that dotted this idyllic suburb was a quaint cottage, seemingly plucked from the pages of a fairy tale. It was here that Sarah Jenkins lived, a woman whose presence once blended seamlessly into the fabric of the community. Her home was adorned with blooming roses that cascaded over a weathered trellis, their vibrant petals a stark contrast to the creeping sense of unease that had begun to settle over Willow Creek. Sarah Jenkins was a gentle soul by day, spending her days tending to her flowers, their vibrant blooms a testament to her green thumb, and helping out at the local library, where her gentle demeanor made her a favorite among the children. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the quiet streets, something changed within Sarah. The first hint of trouble came with the sleepwalking. At first it seemed innocuous enough. Her neighbors, the Johnsons, noticed her wandering the streets late at night, her bare feet tracing aimless patterns in the dew-kissed grass. They thought it was odd but harmless. After all, people sleepwalk all the time, don't they? But soon, the nightly wanderings became more frequent and far more unsettling. Whispers began to spread through Willow Creek like wildfire, carried on the wind and amplified in hushed conversations behind closed doors. Mrs. Thompson, who lived 2 houses down from Sarah, swore she saw Sarah standing in her backyard at 3 a.m, staring up at the moon with a vacant expression. Her eyes, once warm and inviting, now seemed hollow and distant, reflecting a darkness that sent chills down Mrs. Thompson's spine. Old Mr. Reynolds, a cantankerous widower who lived at the end of the street, claimed he heard Sarah muttering to herself in a language he couldn't understand. He described how the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as he listened to her eerie, rhythmic chanting, and how the shadows seemed to dance in unnatural ways around her. Fear began to take root in Willow Creek. The residents, once a tight-knit community, started to avoid Sarah, crossing the street when they saw her coming, locking their doors and windows tight at night. The sense of unease was palpable, a dark cloud that hung over the suburb, growing thicker with each passing night. The story of Sarah's nocturnal activities continued to unfold, each night revealing more unsettling details. One evening, young Tommy Daniels, an adventurous boy with a penchant for sneaking out after dark, saw Sarah digging in her backyard. Her movements were frantic, almost desperate, as she clawed at the earth with her bare hands. He watched, hidden behind a tree, as she unearthed something wrapped in a filthy, tattered cloth. Her hands trembled as she cradled the object, and Tommy swore he heard her whispering to it, her voice low and filled with a strange mix of reverence and fear. Tommy's account only fueled the growing hysteria. Parents began to keep a closer eye on their children, warning them to stay away from Sarah and her house. The once welcoming community gatherings grew sparse, as neighbors preferred the safety of their homes to the open air of Willow Creek streets. Sarah, meanwhile, seemed to grow more isolated and withdrawn. Her once bright eyes were now shadowed with fatigue, her movements sluggish and unsteady. She spoke less and less, her interactions with others reduced to the barest of necessities. It was as if she was slowly fading away, consumed by an invisible force that none could see, but all could feel. One particularly stormy night, the full extent of the terror gripping Willow Creek became evident. The wind howled through the streets, rattling windows and doors, while lightning split the sky with deafening cracks. In the midst of the storm, Sarah was seen again, this time by several neighbors who watched in horrified silence as she moved through the streets like a ghost. She wore a white nightgown, soaked through by the rain and clinging to her thin frame. Her hair, wild and unkempt, whipped around her face as she moved with a purpose that seemed both determined and detached. She stopped in front of each house, staring at the doors for what felt like an eternity before moving on to the next. Her lips moved in silent incantation, her eyes reflecting the flashes of lightning with an eerie, otherworldly glow. The following morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a battered and shaken community. The streets were littered with debris, and the air was thick with a sense of foreboding. Sarah was found in her garden, kneeling beside a freshly dug hole, her hands caked with mud and blood. She was unresponsive, her eyes staring blankly ahead as if trapped in a nightmare from which she couldn't wake. The authorities were called, and Sarah was taken away, her fate unknown to the neighbors who watched with a mixture of relief and fear. As she was led away, her head turned, and for a brief moment her eyes locked onto those of Mrs. Thompson, who stood clutching her rosary. The look in Sarah's eyes was one of pure, unadulterated terror, a silent plea for help that went unanswered. And so the quiet suburb returned to its semblance of normalcy, the events of those nights whispered in hushed tones and quickly forgotten by those who chose to forget. But the darkness that claimed Sarah Jenkins left a mark, a shadow that would forever linger in the hearts of those who witnessed it. Well, that's the end of chapter 1. Poor Sarah's just getting started with her nighttime strolls. Honestly, it's scarier than my last blind date. Stay tuned, love. It's about to get a whole lot worse. Chapter 2. The arrival of Detective Harris. As dawn reluctantly yielded to the encroaching shadows of evening, Detective Michael Harris arrived in Willow Creek, a man hardened by years of unraveling the darkest mysteries that lurked in the city's underbelly. His arrival, marked by the low hum of an unmarked sedan that cut through the serene streets, disrupted the tranquil facade of Willow Creek. Detective Harris was not the kind of man to be easily rattled. His steel-grey eyes, quick to dissect the truths buried beneath layers of deceit, now scanned the picturesque suburb with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. The case file lay open on the passenger seat beside him, the details of Sarah Jenkins's strange behavior and subsequent detainment compelling him to investigate further. The locals, wary of outsiders and the unsettling rumors that clung to Sarah Jenkins like a shroud, regarded him with a mixture of curiosity and fear. He noted the furtive glances from behind fluttering curtains and the hushed conversations that ceased as he approached. The residents of Willow Creek had been living in a state of heightened anxiety, and his presence only seemed to amplify their unease. The first stop on Harris's list was Sarah's quaint cottage, now shrouded in an eerie silence. The once vibrant garden seemed to wilt under an unseen weight, the roses drooping and the grass yellowed. As he approached the front door, he felt a chill that seemed to emanate from within the house itself. The door, slightly ajar, creaked ominously as he pushed it open and stepped inside. The interior of the house was a stark contrast to its charming exterior. Shadows clung to the corners of the room, and a cold, oppressive atmosphere hung in the air. Harris's trained eyes quickly took in the disarray. Furniture overturned, picture frames shattered, and a pervasive sense of chaos that seemed to radiate from every surface. He carefully navigated the wreckage, his flashlight cutting through the darkness as he searched for clues. In the living room, he found Sarah's diary, its pages filled with cryptic scribbles and disturbing sketches. The entries started off normal enough, detailing her daily routines and interactions with neighbors. But as he flipped through the pages, the tone shifted dramatically. The handwriting became erratic, the sentences disjointed and frantic. References to the darkness and the voices appeared repeatedly, each entry more frantic than the last. One entry, dated a week before her detainment, stood out. "I can feel it growing stronger every night. The voices are getting louder, more insistent. They want something from me, but I don't know what. I'm so tired, so scared. I don't know how much longer I can fight it." As Harris read these words, a shiver ran down his spine. He had seen many things in his career, but the palpable fear and desperation in Sarah's writing unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite explain. Continuing his search, Harris made his way to the basement. The door, heavy and foreboding, seemed to resist his attempts to open it, but he finally managed to wrench it free. A musty, damp smell greeted him as he descended the creaking wooden steps. The basement was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. In the center of the room, he found a large wooden crate, its lid partially pried open. Inside, buried beneath layers of old cloth and dirt, lay various trinkets and relics that seemed out of place in such a suburban setting. Old coins, worn books, and strange symbols carved into bits of wood. But one item in particular caught his eye. An ornate hand-carved box, small enough to fit in his hand, yet heavy with an unsettling aura. Harris carefully picked up the box and examined it. The lid was adorned with intricate patterns, and as he opened it, he found a small blackened mirror inside. As he stared into the mirror, an overwhelming sense of dread washed over him. It was as if the mirror was a portal to something far more sinister than he could comprehend. Shaken, he closed the box and took it with him, feeling that it might hold some key to understanding Sarah's condition. As he ascended the basement stairs, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that the shadows were closing in around him. Back in the main part of the house, Harris's attention was drawn to a faint noise coming from the attic. His heart pounded in his chest as he climbed the narrow, rickety staircase, flashlight in hand. The air grew colder the higher he climbed, and the sense of dread intensified. The attic door creaked open, revealing a space cluttered with old furniture, dusty boxes, and cobwebs that seemed to stretch endlessly. In the far corner of the attic, he saw something that made his blood run cold. An old, full-length mirror stood against the wall, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust. As he approached, the temperature in the room seemed to drop even further. He wiped away the dust with a trembling hand, revealing a reflection that was not his own. The image staring back at him was Sarah, but twisted and distorted. Her eyes were dark voids, her mouth twisted into a silent scream. As he watched, the reflection moved independently, reaching out towards him with clawed hands. Harris stumbled back, his flashlight clattering to the floor, its beam casting frantic shadows around the room. Just as suddenly as it appeared, the apparition vanished, leaving only Harris's terrified reflection staring back at him. He hurriedly descended the attic stairs, his mind racing with the implications of what he had seen. This was no ordinary case of sleepwalking or mental illness. Something far darker was at play. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Harris decided to visit the local priest, Father O'Leary, who had been involved in Sarah's case before her detainment. The priest's small church, a haven of peace in the midst of the turmoil, provided a stark contrast to the darkness Harris had just encountered. Father O'Leary, a kindly but weary man, greeted Harris with a somber expression. As they sat in the dimly lit office, the priest recounted his attempts to help Sarah. "She came to me, desperate and frightened," Father O'Leary began, his voice tinged with sorrow. "She spoke of voices, of an oppressive darkness that followed her every move. I performed a blessing on her home, but it did little to alleviate her suffering. It was as if something had taken root within her, something beyond my understanding." Harris shared his findings with the priest, including the unsettling diary entries and the strange box from the basement. Father O'Leary examined the box with a mixture of reverence and fear, his face growing pale as he recognized the symbols carved into it. "These symbols, they are ancient, linked to rituals meant to summon and bind spirits," the priest explained. "I fear that Sarah may have unwittingly become the vessel for something far more malevolent than we can comprehend." With this revelation, the gravity of the situation became clear. Harris and Father O'Leary knew they had to act quickly to save Sarah and prevent further harm from befalling Willow Creek. But as they planned their next steps, an ominous feeling lingered in the air, a sense that the darkness had already set its sights on them, and time was running out. And just a quick reminder, if you're enjoying this spine-chilling tale, make sure to like and subscribe to Evil Exposed. It really helps out, and there's plenty more where this came from. Now, let's get back to the horror. Well, that's chapter 2 for you. Detective Harris thought he was just dealing with a few sleepless nights. Poor sod. It's about to get messier than a pub loo on a Saturday night. Just wait till the real horrors start crawling out of the woodwork. Chapter 3: Nightfall and Unexplained Phenomena. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across Willow Creek, an uneasy stillness settled over the suburb. Nightfall brought with it an air of anticipation, a collective holding of breath as darkness enveloped the town. The quiet was broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant howls of stray dogs. This night, however, would be different. Detective Harris, now armed with the knowledge of Sarah's ordeal and the sinister relic from her home, prepared for another long night. He couldn't shake the feeling that the true horror had yet to reveal itself. With Father O'Leary's warning echoing in his mind, he made his way back to Sarah's cottage, determined to uncover the truth. The house, now devoid of its former charm, stood like a silent sentinel against the encroaching night. Harris parked his car a short distance away and approached the cottage on foot, the crunch of gravel beneath his shoes the only sound in the oppressive silence. As he reached the front door, he hesitated, a sense of dread washing over him. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior was cloaked in darkness, the air thick with the scent of decay and something far more sinister. Harris clicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom to reveal the disarray that greeted him earlier. He moved cautiously, each creak of the floorboards amplified in the stillness. His goal was the attic, where he had seen the horrifying apparition the previous night. As he climbed the narrow staircase, the temperature seemed to drop with each step, the air growing colder and more oppressive. He reached the attic door and pushed it open, his flashlight revealing the cluttered space once more. The mirror stood in its place, its surface reflecting nothing but shadows. Harris approached the mirror, his heartbeat echoing in his ears. He reached out a hand, hesitating for a moment before wiping away the layer of dust. The reflection that met him was his own, but something about it felt wrong. His face seemed distorted, the shadows playing tricks on his mind. Just as he was about to turn away, the reflection changed. Sarah's twisted visage appeared once more, her eyes black voids, her mouth open in a silent scream. But this time the reflection didn't remain confined to the mirror. The figure of Sarah stepped out, a ghostly apparition that moved with a terrifying fluidity. Harris stumbled back, his flashlight flickering as the air around him grew colder still. The ghostly Sarah reached out, her fingers brushing against his arm. The touch was icy, sending a jolt of fear through Harris. He tried to back away, but his feet seemed rooted to the spot. The apparition leaned in close, her breath cold against his skin as she whispered in a voice that seemed to echo from the depths of a nightmare. "You cannot save her," the voice hissed, each word dripping with malice. "She belongs to us now." Harris fought to regain control, his mind racing as the apparition loomed over him. Summoning all his strength, he managed to break free, stumbling back and nearly falling down the attic stairs. He bolted down the staircase, the sense of dread following him like a shadow. Back in the main part of the house, he tried to catch his breath, his mind reeling from the encounter. The house seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, the shadows deepening and shifting as if alive. Determined to uncover more, Harris moved to the basement, the oppressive atmosphere growing thicker with each step. The basement, dimly lit by a single flickering bulb, felt like a tomb. Harris's flashlight revealed the same strange relics and trinkets he'd seen before, but now they seemed to emanate a sinister glow. As he approached the wooden crate, a low, guttural growl filled the air, sending chills down his spine. He opened the crate, the ornate box with the blackened mirror still inside. As he stared into the mirror, the sense of dread intensified. This time he saw more than just Sarah's twisted reflection. Faces of others, long dead and tormented, swirled within the mirror's depths, their eyes pleading for release. A sudden sharp noise behind him made Harris spin around, his flashlight beam revealing nothing but darkness. But he could feel it. Something was there, watching, waiting. The temperature plummeted further, and the oppressive silence was shattered by the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and coming closer. Harris backed away, his heart pounding as the footsteps grew louder. He turned to the stairs, but the path was blocked by a shadowy figure, its form indistinct but radiating malevolence. The figure moved closer, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Harris raised his flashlight, but the beam seemed to pass through the figure, doing nothing to deter its advance. Desperate, Harris clutched the ornate box, feeling its weight and the unsettling energy it contained. In a moment of clarity, he realized the box might be the key to understanding and stopping the horror that had taken hold of Sarah and her home. He turned back to the basement, determined to find anything that could help. As he rifled through the crate, a series of frantic whispers filled the air, voices overlapping and growing in intensity. Harris's fingers brushed against an old leather-bound book, its cover adorned with the same symbols as the box. He opened it, the pages filled with ancient texts and illustrations depicting dark rituals and malevolent spirits. The whispers grew louder, the shadows closing in around him. Harris's eyes scanned the pages, searching for anything that could offer a clue. His breath caught as he found a passage describing a ritual to summon and bind spirits, eerily similar to what Father O'Leary had mentioned. Just as he began to understand the gravity of what he was reading, the shadows surged forward, engulfing him in darkness. The flashlight flickered and died, leaving him in complete blackness. The whispers became screams, the air filled with an unbearable pressure. Harris felt something cold and clammy wrap around his wrist, pulling him deeper into the darkness. He fought against it, but the grip tightened, dragging him toward an unseen abyss. In a last, desperate act, he clutched the book to his chest, his mind racing with the realization that he had to find a way to break the curse or be consumed by it. As he struggled, a sudden blinding light filled the basement, and the shadows recoiled with a hiss. Harris blinked, disoriented, as the light revealed Father O'Leary standing at the top of the stairs, holding a large, glowing crucifix. The priest's voice rang out clear and commanding as he chanted an ancient prayer. The oppressive energy in the room seemed to waver, the shadows retreating before the light. Harris felt the grip on his wrist loosen, and he scrambled to his feet, clutching the book and the box. Together, he and Father O'Leary managed to push back the darkness, the air growing warmer as the light filled every corner of the basement. Exhausted and shaken, Harris followed the priest out of the house, the oppressive atmosphere lifting as they stepped into the night. The stars above seemed brighter, the air clearer, as if the very fabric of reality had shifted. But Harris knew that the battle was far from over. The relics and the book held secrets that could help them understand and ultimately defeat the malevolent force that had taken hold of Sarah Jenkins. As they made their way back to the church, Harris couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness was still watching, waiting for its chance to strike again. Well, there you have it. Poor Sarah's stuck in that mirror like my dentures in a toffee. Now, if you're ready, let's dive into Chapter 4, where the real horrors begin. Chapter 4, The Awakening of the Curse. The stillness of Willow Creek was shattered as midnight approached. A thick fog rolled in, swallowing the suburb in a suffocating embrace. It was an unnatural fog, dense and cold, obscuring the moon and stars. Within this fog, a sinister presence lurked, its unseen eyes fixed on the quiet streets and the unsuspecting inhabitants. Detective Harris and Father O'Leary stood in the church's dimly lit sanctuary, the ancient book and the ornate box with the blackened mirror laid out on the altar. They had spent hours deciphering the cryptic texts, piecing together the dark rituals that bound the malevolent spirit to Sarah Jenkins. As the clock struck midnight, a chill ran down Harris's spine. The air grew heavy, and a low, guttural growl resonated through the church, shaking the very foundations. The candles flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows on the walls. Father O'Leary clutched his crucifix tightly, his knuckles white with tension. "It's starting," the priest whispered, his voice trembling. "The curse is awakening." Outside, the fog thickened, seeping into every crevice and corner. It curled around the trees, slid under doors, and wrapped around the homes of Willow Creek. The residents, now used to the strange occurrences, huddled in their homes, unaware of the horror that was about to be unleashed. In Sarah Jenkins's house, the atmosphere was palpable. The shadows deepened, and an oppressive force seemed to press down on the very walls. From the attic to the basement, an unholy energy thrummed through the air, growing stronger with each passing second. Sarah lay on her bed, her body rigid and cold. Her eyes, wide open and unseeing, stared at the ceiling. Her lips moved silently, repeating an ancient incantation. As the final words left her mouth, her body convulsed violently, and a blood-curdling scream tore through the night. The scream echoed through Willow Creek, rousing the residents from their uneasy slumber. They peeked through their windows, their faces pale with fear, but it was too late. The curse had awakened. In the basement of Sarah's house, the wooden crate burst open with a deafening crack. Dark tendrils of smoke poured out, writhing and twisting like serpents. They spread through the house, slithering up the walls and across the floors. The air grew thick with the stench of decay and blood. Harris and Father O'Leary, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, rushed out of the church and towards Sarah's house. The fog swirled around them, obscuring their vision and chilling them to the bone. As they approached the house, they could see the dark tendrils of smoke seeping through the windows and doors, a malignant force ready to consume everything in its path. Inside, the horror escalated. The dark smoke coalesced into a grotesque figure, a towering abomination of twisted flesh and shadow. Its eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and its mouth opened in a ghastly grin, revealing rows of jagged, blood-stained teeth. The creature moved with unnatural speed, its limbs stretching and contorting as it prowled through the house. It left a trail of blood and destruction in its wake, the walls and floors splattered with gore. The once cozy home was now a nightmarish landscape of terror. Sarah's body was lifted off the bed, suspended in midair by the dark tendrils. Her skin grew pale and translucent, her veins darkening with the malevolent energy coursing through her. Her eyes, once hollow and vacant, now burned with the same eerie light as the creature's. Harris and Father O'Leary burst through the front door, their hearts pounding with fear and determination. The sight that greeted them was beyond anything they had ever imagined. The house was a macabre tableau, with blood dripping from the walls and the floor slick with crimson. The air was filled with the sound of wet, tearing flesh and the guttural growls of the creature. "We have to stop it!" Father O'Leary shouted, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of horror. He raised his crucifix, chanting the ancient prayers he had memorized, his voice strong despite the fear that gripped him. Harris, clutching the ancient book, joined in the chant, his voice shaking but resolute. The creature turned its glowing eyes toward them, its grin widening. It let out a deafening roar, the sound reverberating through the house and shaking the very foundations. The dark tendrils holding Sarah began to tighten, her body convulsing in agony. Blood oozed from her mouth, nose, and eyes, her screams mingling with the creature's roars. The air grew colder, the shadows deepening as the malevolent force fought against the holy energy emanating from the crucifix. Father O'Leary stepped forward, his voice rising in pitch and intensity. The crucifix glowed with a bright, pure light, the energy pushing back against the darkness. Harris, sensing the creature's weakening grip, opened the ornate box, revealing the blackened mirror inside. The creature's eyes widened in recognition and fear as it saw the mirror. Harris held it up, directing the reflective surface toward the abomination. The mirror began to glow with an intense light, its surface swirling with the faces of the tormented souls trapped within. With a final desperate effort, Harris and Father O'Leary combined their strength, their voices merging in a powerful chant. The light from the crucifix and the mirror intensified, bathing the room in a blinding radiance. The creature howled in pain, its form disintegrating as the holy energy consumed it. The dark tendrils holding Sarah snapped, and she fell to the floor, unconscious but alive. The creature's roars faded into nothingness, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted, replaced by a calm, peaceful silence. Exhausted and shaken, Harris and Father O'Leary collapsed to their knees, the relief washing over them in waves. They had defeated the malevolent force, but the cost had been high. The house was a ruin, a testament to the horrors that had taken place within its walls. As the first light of dawn broke through the fog, Harris and Father O'Leary helped Sarah to her feet. She was weak and disoriented, but the light in her eyes had returned. The curse had been lifted, and she was free. But the memory of that night would haunt Willow Creek forever. The quiet suburb would never be the same, its residents scarred by the horrors they had witnessed. And though the malevolent force had been vanquished, the shadows that had claimed Sarah Jenkins left a mark, a reminder that true evil could lurk even in the most peaceful of places. Blimey, Father O'Leary faced more demons than a drunk at last call. Now get ready for the next part, where things really start to get gruesome. Chapter 5. Descent into Madness. The initial victory over the malevolent force brought a fleeting sense of relief to Willow Creek. But as days turned into nights, the true depth of the horror began to reveal itself. The shadows that once lurked in the corners of the quiet suburb seemed to stretch and grow, feeding on the residual fear that clung to the air. The battle was won, but the war was far from over. Detective Harris and Father O'Leary knew they had only scratched the surface of the darkness that had taken root. The ancient book they had used to fend off the creature held more secrets, and as they delved deeper into its pages, they uncovered a horrifying truth. The ritual they performed had only weakened the entity. It had not destroyed it. Sarah Jenkins, though freed from the immediate grasp of the malevolent force, remained in a fragile state. Her nights were plagued by vivid nightmares, visions of dark figures and blood-soaked corridors. Her once gentle demeanor was replaced by a haunted, distant look, her eyes reflecting the horrors she had witnessed. The residents of Willow Creek began to experience strange phenomena. Dark shadows flitted across their periphery, whispers filled the silence of the night, and a chilling cold seemed to emanate from the very ground. Pets went missing, only to be found mutilated in grotesque displays. The sense of dread that had briefly lifted returned with a vengeance, heavier and more oppressive than before. One night, as the fog rolled in thicker than ever, Sarah woke in a cold sweat, her body trembling. She felt an overwhelming urge to return to her house, to the place where it all began. Driven by an unseen force, she made her way through the silent streets, her bare feet barely making a sound on the pavement. Detective Harris, unable to sleep and plagued by his own nightmares, noticed Sarah's absence. Fearing the worst, he followed her, keeping a safe distance as she made her way back to the cursed cottage. The fog swirled around her, almost as if guiding her steps. Inside the house, the atmosphere was even more oppressive than before. The walls seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the very air thick with malevolence. Sarah stood in the center of the living room, her eyes fixed on the mirror that had played a central role in her torment. As Harris entered the house, he felt a wave of nausea wash over him. The shadows seemed to stretch towards him, whispering in a language he couldn't understand. He approached Sarah cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. "Sarah," he called out softly, his voice trembling. "You need to leave this place. It's not safe." She turned to face him, her eyes reflecting the flickering candlelight. "I can't leave," she whispered, her voice filled with a strange calm. "It's not over. It's inside me. It always has been." Before Harris could react, Sarah's body convulsed violently, her back arching as a guttural scream tore from her throat. Dark tendrils of smoke erupted from her mouth and eyes, filling the room with an acrid stench. The shadows coalesced into a familiar, horrifying shape, the creature they had thought defeated. The creature's eyes glowed with malevolent glee as it reformed, towering over Harris and the convulsing Sarah. Its laughter filled the room, a sound that resonated with pure evil. The ground beneath them seemed to tremble, and the walls bled a thick black ichor. Harris, driven by a desperate need to save Sarah, lunged for the mirror. He remembered the power it had over the creature and hoped it could once again help them. As he grabbed the mirror, the creature turned its gaze towards him, its eyes burning with rage. "You cannot stop me," it hissed, its voice echoing with 1,000 tormented souls. "She is mine. This place is mine." With a surge of adrenaline, Harris raised the mirror, directing its reflective surface towards the creature. The mirror began to glow, its light intensifying as it captured the creature's gaze. The dark tendrils recoiled and the creature let out a deafening roar, its form flickering like a flame in the wind. But this time, the mirror alone was not enough. The creature fought back, its tendrils lashing out and wrapping around Harris, pulling him closer. The air grew colder, the darkness thicker, as the struggle between light and shadow reached its peak. Suddenly, Father O'Leary burst into the room, his crucifix held high. He joined Harris in the struggle, chanting prayers of exorcism with renewed vigor. The combined light of the mirror and the crucifix grew blinding, filling every corner of the house with a purifying glow. The creature's form began to waver, its roars turning to screams of agony. The tendrils holding Harris loosened their grip, and he fell to the ground, clutching the mirror. The light from the crucifix intensified, burning away the shadows and forcing the creature back. With a final, ear-splitting scream, the creature disintegrated into a cloud of dark smoke, which was quickly absorbed by the mirror. The house fell silent, the oppressive atmosphere lifting as the last remnants of the malevolent force were vanquished. Sarah collapsed to the floor, her body trembling but alive. Father O'Leary rushed to her side, offering words of comfort and reassurance. Harris, exhausted and battered, stood up slowly, his eyes scanning the room for any remaining threats. The house, once a site of unimaginable horror, now felt strangely peaceful. The blood and gore that had stained the walls and floors had vanished, leaving behind only the faint scent of smoke. The oppressive cold had been replaced by a comforting warmth, as if the very soul of the house had been cleansed. Harris and Father O'Leary helped Sarah to her feet, guiding her out of the house and into the fresh air. The fog had begun to dissipate, revealing the first light of dawn breaking over Willow Creek. The town, though scarred by the horrors it had endured, seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. As they made their way back to the church, Harris couldn't shake the feeling that the true battle was only just beginning. The ancient book and the mirror held secrets that they had yet to uncover, and he knew that the malevolent force they had faced was only one of many. But for now, they had won a hard-fought victory. The curse that had plagued Sarah Jenkins had been lifted, and the darkness that had threatened to consume Willow Creek had been pushed back. As they stepped into the sanctuary of the church, the morning light casting long shadows on the floor, Harris and Father O'Leary vowed to continue their fight against the forces of evil, no matter where it led them. Bloody hell, that last bit was more hair-raising than my uncle's hairy back. Now let's wrap things up with Chapter 6, Echoes of Darkness. With the dawn of a new day, Willow Creek began its slow recovery from the horrors that had befallen it. The residents, though still haunted by the memories of the past nights, found solace in the sunlight and the sense of normalcy that began to return. The town, bathed in the golden morning light, appeared peaceful and untouched, a stark contrast to the terror that had once gripped it. Detective Harris and Father O'Leary, though exhausted, felt a sense of accomplishment. They had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, saving Sarah Jenkins and the town from an unimaginable fate. As they stood together on the steps of the church, they watched the townspeople begin to resume their daily routines, cautiously hopeful that the nightmare was over. Sarah, though physically free from the entity's grasp, remained fragile. Her eyes, once haunted and distant, now reflected a glimmer of hope, but also a lingering fear. Harris and Father O'Leary knew that her recovery would be a long journey, one that would require the support of the entire community. Weeks passed, and the events that had nearly destroyed Willow Creek slowly faded into the background. The town began to heal, the scars of the past nights gradually becoming part of its history. Yet despite the apparent peace, an undercurrent of unease persisted. One evening, as the sun set and the shadows lengthened, Harris found himself drawn to Sarah's cottage. He hadn't visited since the night of the final exorcism, and an inexplicable urge compelled him to return. As he approached the house, the air grew colder, and a familiar chill ran down his spine. The cottage appeared as it always had, quaint and charming, with roses blooming over the trellis. But as Harris stepped inside, the temperature plummeted, and a sense of foreboding washed over him. The house was silent, save for the faint creaking of the floorboards under his feet. He made his way to the living room, where the shattered mirror and the remnants of the ancient book still lay. The room, now bathed in the dim light of the setting sun, felt different, darker, more oppressive. As Harris bent down to examine the broken mirror, a sudden movement caught his eye. He turned, his heart pounding, to see a shadow flit across the room. It was quick, barely more than a flicker, but it was enough to set his nerves on edge. He stood up, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of the source. The shadows seemed to stretch and shift, as if mocking his efforts to find them. Just as he was about to dismiss it as a trick of the light, he heard a soft whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. It was a voice, faint and distant, calling his name. The sound sent chills down his spine, and he felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice echoing through the empty house. The only response was silence, thick and suffocating. He took a cautious step forward, his senses on high alert. The whisper came again, louder this time, filled with a desperate urgency. "Michael!" Harris's blood ran cold. He recognized the voice. It was Sarah's. He turned towards the direction of the sound, his heart pounding in his chest. The living room seemed to grow darker, the shadows closing in around him. "Sarah?" he called out, his voice trembling. "Where are you?" The whisper repeated his name, a chilling echo that seemed to come from all directions at once. The air grew heavier, and the oppressive feeling intensified. Harris felt a presence behind him, and he turned slowly, his breath catching in his throat. There, standing in the doorway, was Sarah. But it wasn't the Sarah he had saved. Her eyes were dark voids, her skin pale and translucent. She stood motionless, her gaze fixed on him with an unsettling intensity. "Michael," she whispered, her voice a haunting echo. "You shouldn't have come back." Harris took a step back, his mind racing. This couldn't be real. Sarah was safe, recovering under the care of Father O'Leary, but the figure before him seemed all too real, her presence filling the room with an overpowering sense of dread. "What are you?" he demanded, his voice barely more than a whisper. The figure smiled, a chilling, empty smile. "You freed her, but you didn't free me. I am the darkness that was bound to this place, and now I am free." Harris felt a wave of nausea wash over him as the realization hit. The entity they had fought was not entirely vanquished. It had merely shifted, finding a new host. The house, the very ground on which it stood, was still tainted by its presence. Before he could react, the figure lunged at him, moving with unnatural speed. Harris stumbled back, crashing into the broken remnants of the mirror. The shards of glass cut into his skin, and he felt a cold, clammy hand wrap around his throat. The room seemed to spin, the shadows closing in as the figure tightened its grip. Harris's vision blurred, and he struggled to breathe, his hands clawing at the icy fingers. The last thing he saw before the darkness claimed him was the figure's empty eyes, staring into his soul with a promise of eternal torment. The next morning, Father O'Leary found Harris's lifeless body in the living room of Sarah's cottage. The scene was eerily quiet, the air thick with the lingering presence of the malevolent force. The priest knelt beside Harris, his heart heavy with grief and dread. As he whispered a prayer for Harris's soul, he couldn't shake the feeling that they had only delayed the inevitable. The darkness that had plagued Willow Creek was still present, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next opportunity to strike. And so, the quiet suburb of Willow Creek continued its uneasy existence, the memory of the horrors it had endured never fully fading. The townspeople carried on with their lives, but the shadows in the corners of their homes and the whispers in the night served as a constant reminder. The battle against the malevolent force had been won, but the war was far from over. For in the heart of Willow Creek, where the sunlight danced lazily through the rustling leaves and the whispers of a distant past lingered in the evening breeze, a darkness still lurked, waiting for its chance to rise again. Well, bloody hell, Harris went out quicker than my patience at the DMV. If you enjoyed this twisted tale and want more spine-chilling stories, make sure to like and subscribe to Evil Exposed. Cheers, love.